Hello, I'm Ben Friedman. I'm the Policy Director at Defense Priorities, and we're here today live streaming to talk about the South China Sea, recent developments in the U.S. Posture there, the Chinese actions, and so on. If you were following the news, it was an exciting weekend in the South China Sea. There was a series of incidents involving two particular locations in the South China Sea where the Chinese ships either water cannoned or rammed or otherwise harassed different Filipino ships. And that is part of what you could say is a emerging or accelerating pattern of more aggressive behavior from the Chinese side and asserting what they see as their right uh, of control over that area. And we've seen in recent months assurances from the United States, from President Biden and the Secretary of Defense, that the United States will defend the Philippines, our ally, up to and including these areas in the South China Sea. There's it's definitely a flashpoint in the world in U.S.-China relations, and it's flashing in particular right now. So we have an excellent panel here to discuss that today with three speakers. The first uh, is Lyle Goldstein, who's the Director of Asia Engagement at Defense Priorities. He was previously professor at the Naval War College for 20 plus years, where he was and he remains immersed in these issues, and Lyle's the author of a lot of works in I think a 2015 book related to Chinese foreign policy and how it interacts with the U.S. Second, we have Shushan Lau, who's a assistant professor of Asian studies at the University of Hawaii. She studies maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, Chinese foreign policy, and U.S.-China relations, especially crisis management. Third, we have Lisa Curtis, who's a senior fellow and director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at CNAS, the Center for New American Security. She has a lot of experience in the United States government in national security, including at the NSC, CIA, the State Department, and on Capitol Hill. She served as assistant to the president, NSC senior director for South and Central Asia in the last part of the last decade and up until 2021. So with that, we'll go over to remarks from each of our panelists, and then we'll have Q&A for the remainder. So Lyle, kick it off, please.
All right, folks. Thanks for joining us, Ben. Thanks for moderating, and to the whole Defense Priority team. It's great to be on this panel, and special thanks to our the other panelists who are joining me. Let me see if I can make a few points. It's a very complicated set of issues, but I'll say a few things just to kind of set the table. I am a big fan of the U.S.-Philippines alliance. This goes back, many, many decades. There's a lot of history here, some of it bad, a lot of it good. That said, though, I strongly believe that the United States should not go to war over rocks or reefs or shoals. I don't think we should even be contemplating war over that issue. There are things the United States should consider war with China over, but that's, that doesn't make the list, in my view. This is just pure common sense. I think we need to apply realism and restraint here. And, I'll amplify a little, but we've got to recognize that there are international legal disputes and fishing disputes all over the world. I mean, we have major disputes in international law with Canada, for example. France and Britain, I think, deployed some vessels last year, in 2021 over a fishing dispute. So it's not that, this kind of thing is very common. We shouldn't get excessively worked up about it. Sure, is China bullying the Philippines? Yes. But China's actions are also, we should say, fairly restrained. We're talking about water cannons, folks. So that right there is a very clear signal that China does not want to go to war over this. I can give other examples too. What is this about, really? In my view, most of this is explained actually by Taiwan. We are accustomed in the US to talking about Taiwan as one issue and South China Sea as another issue. But in fact, the two are closely linked. And I think a lot of China's very, much more aggressive behavior has to do with our upgrade of the Philippines alliance to be very relevant to a Taiwan scenario. And that means getting involved with bases right on the Luzon Strait, which are, just 100 miles from Taiwan. And China is watching this very carefully and is very upset about this. So I would say we shouldn't play games in this gray zone. We're not going to win that. We should make our alliance with the Philippines defensive. And that means focusing on defense of the main islands, not really concerned with reefs and rocks out there. I'll just close with a quick anecdote from a fascinating interaction I had with Admiral Jonathan Greenert, who led our Navy as Chief of Naval Operations from 2011 to 2015. And I remember encountering him at a big conference. It was sort of the usual DoD conference. I think this is the one sponsored by NBR that focuses on PLA generally. And when he stood up at this conference to give a keynote lecture, somebody in the audience, this was in about 2016, raised the question and said, Admiral Greener, why didn't you respond when the Chinese set up those bases in the South China Sea? And his answer was very simple. He said, as he understood it, and this is a guy who was commander of 7th Fleet and a submarine commander. He knows a lot about naval warfare in the Pacific context. He says, at that point, the choice was whether to go to war or not over these bases. And he said, we were absolutely not going to go to war over the setup of those bases. And he said our policies should flow from that, and they should be cautious and restrained. And I think he was exactly right. And we continue to face such choices, but we should, continue to exercise caution and restraint, and we can manage these disputes with China going forward. I'm convinced of that. So thanks very much. I'll be anxious to hear what the other panelists have to say.
Go ahead, Shushan.
Good. Thank you, Ben, and thank you for inviting me. And I think I'll start my discussion by saying that my view is that the United States has been so far lacked a coherent, clear-eyed South China Sea strategy to achieve America's fundamental interest in this region, which I think should be is twofolded. So on the one hand, I think it's it's the U.S. core interest to promote peace and stability and make sure we have open access to maritime commons and maintain U.S. reputation as a credible ally. Like Lau just said, I'm also an admirer for the longstanding U.S.-Philippine alliance, and also at the same time to make sure that maritime disputes in this region are settled without intimidation or use of force. But on the other hand, I think it's equally in the U.S. core interest to avoid being unwantedly dragged into a direct conflict with China. And on this regard, I also agree with Lau that we should avoid a war, a military conflict, or even a war with China over the reefs and land features in the South China Sea. And also to demonstrate the U.S. sincerity in supporting ASEAN centrality in managing the tensions in this region. And also, whenever possible, to encourage, it's also in the U.S. interest to encourage mutual accommodation between China and other claimants. But since so far much of my study has focused on what drives China's decision making and its behavior in the South China Sea, so based on what I've already known, that is that the U.S. approach towards South China Sea has gone from one extreme to another, which especially in the past decade, spanning from the Obama administration through Trump administration and to the current administration under President Joe Biden. So the U.S. approach has in effect considerably undermine America's capability of shaping China's behavior by shaping Beijing's cost-benefit calculation. I could dive into details later on during the Q&A, but I think under the Biden administration, it has so far repeatedly reassured U.S. allies, especially Philippines, that America's alliance commitments are ironclad. But to some extent, in my opinion, the Biden administration's alliance policy is kind of overcorrecting the Trump administration's alliance policy, and it risks another pitfall in the alliance politics, i.e., entrapment. So that is to say, Washington needs to be more careful in guarding against the potential danger, as allies may see America's support and also see the strategic competition between the United States and China as providing an opportunity for securing unconditional and unlimited U.S. support, so that they may feel encouraged to walk into short-term confrontation with the Chinese, in a bit to quickly solve a long-term problem, a long-term protracted territorial problem. When it comes to affirming U.S. alliance obligation, I think yes, the Philippines are seeking a commitment from the United States that is kind of similar to what we gave to the Japanese in terms of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty explicitly covers the Senkaku Islands. But it should be noted that when the United States gave this kind of affirmation regarding the coverage of Senkaku under the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, we qualified it. If we look back to the track record, that how we frame our affirmation is, well, we affirming the alliance obligation, we also qualified it with some kind of expression or framing that we had no expectation that the situation in East China Sea would escalate to the kind of level that would invoke the treaty. So, in my opinion, even if the United States need to provide some clarification or affirmation of its alliance obligation with respect to our alliance with the Philippines in the South China Sea, we should also use a similar kind of qualification to clearly say that we don't expect the treaty should be relevant, because we don't expect the situation will be elevated to an extent that to invoke the treaty. So I think I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to look forward to a discussion later on.
Thanks. Lisa, go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you, Ben, and thanks to Defense Priorities for organizing this really important and timely event, looking at Chinese gray zone activities in the South China Sea. So Chinese maritime bullying, intimidation is certainly not new, but it has intensified in the recent past, and especially against the Philippines. And of course, when we're talking about gray zone tactics, we're talking about actions that are designed to intimidate and coerce and change the status quo, but that are below that threshold of evoking a military response. And as Ben had mentioned, the latest example of Chinese gray zone activities happened over the weekend, when the Chinese used water cannons against Filipino fishing vessels to prevent them from accessing areas in disputed waters near the Scarborough Shoal. And also on Sunday, the Chinese again used water cannons and ramming tactics against Philippines Coast Guard vessels that were seeking to resupply their outpost at Second Thomas Shoal. The Philippines condemned the behavior as a serious escalation of Chinese aggression. The U.S. also condemned the activities. So I think what's notable is how much the Philippines is standing up to this activity, relying in some cases on unconventional creative tactics, sort of taking a page out of China's own playbook. One example was, of course, in October, when Philippine Coast Guard officials disguised as fishermen removed a string of buoys that were blocking Filipino fishermen from accessing waters in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. And I think this symbolic display of resistance was important. It exposes the Chinese tactics, and it also demonstrates to other nations that there are ways to stand up to Chinese maritime aggression and to push back. The Philippines has also been filming Chinese actions and sharing the footage with news outlets, which I think has been effective. It's bringing to the world's attention what the Chinese are doing to these smaller nations and asserting these expansive and illegal maritime claims. So I think in terms of how the U.S. should be responding, I think I do disagree to some degree with the previous panelists. And I think that if we say that there is no space between not letting China get away with gray zone activities and going to war, then we're setting up a false choice. I would argue there's a lot of space between the two, and that we certainly should be using U.S. policy tools, our relationship with these countries to help them protect their own sovereignty. And I would argue that if you let China get away with doing something like forcing the Philippines to abandon its outpost at Second Thomas Shoal, then that in of itself is a risk that you're taking, and you're potentially setting up a situation where the Chinese are emboldened and are going to continue to encroach on territory there and continue to pursue these expansive and illegal claims. So in a recent article that I had written in The Diplomat, I argued that despite the risk that tensions could further escalate in the South China Sea, I think it's important that Washington continue to stand firmly behind Manila. Because, let's face it, Beijing is not only testing Manila, but it's also testing the resolve of Washington and seeing, whether the U.S. really will stand with its allies and by its treaty commitments. And I think that's particularly important right now when we have so many other conflicts happening in the Middle East, Ukraine. It's important that Washington continue to monitor these situations and stand by its allies. And certainly, Taiwan is the strategic priority, but the South China Sea also demands our immediate attention. And we can't sort of let the situation go. And I would argue that we should double down on our relationship with the Philippines. We should encourage other allies like Australia, Japan, even India, South Korea to also support the Philippines, both diplomatically, even militarily. And we should be building their capacity, helping them build their own capacity, as well as other Southeast Asian nations like Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia. And we should also be increasing transparency about what is happening in the South China Sea. We cannot step away or tread lightly. We need to show what's happening and be clear about it. And in this regard, I commend the State Department's recently released report by the Global Engagement Center on Chinese influence operations. This was released, I think, about 6 weeks ago, but it's well worth a read. And I think it's good that we're getting information out there which is describing the Chinese strategy and what they're doing, so that we know precisely how to push back on it without provoking any kind of wider conflict, certainly not war. So let me just leave it at that. Thank you. Look forward to the questions.
Okay, thank you all. I have a lot of questions, so hopefully we can get through them. First of all of you touched on this somewhat, but I would like to know what you think the stakes are in these disputes for the United States. So how would you attach what's happening in the South China Sea to core U.S. interests or some U.S. interests? And if you don't think they attach to core U.S. interests, explain why not, why you differ from those who do. So maybe we can just go in the same order that we did the remarks in.
All right, sure. I mean, I do think there are some interests at stake here for sure. The United States has this longstanding treaty with Philippines, and like I said, Philippines is a country that we're very much attached to. Maybe even I would say, even more than almost any other country in the region. Part of that is if you don't know, many Filipinos have done extremely distinguished service in the U.S. Armed Forces. So, these cultural historical ties run really deep, and as I said, there's some bad history there too. Of the period of colonization. And yet, if we step back and think as realists and think about the balance of power, I have to say, my view is our interests are rather minimal in this area. Some people try to argue that, Philippines is kind of the linchpin. It's a key position in the first island chain. We need to keep this cork in the bottle of China's naval expansion, similar argument to that made on Taiwan. I'm not buying that. Philippines has some importance. It has some advantageous geography, but it's also very easily defended. This is just thousands of islands out there. Even if we had to, in the case of the very worst case where China invaded one of the large islands, we could always assemble a defense on some of the rearward islands, and come back, and hold the line. So to me, I think we have to realize that really it's just not true that we have immense interest in the South China Sea. I mean, it's true, these are economies that are growing robustly, fine, but again, I don't. To me, that's market competition, and we should let the free market prevail. And the idea that we're going to squeeze China out of this market is crazy. But at the same time, I don't think they're going to squeeze us out of that market. We have this long tradition. What I really disagree with is this kind of bizarre incantation one hears in the hallways in DC all the time, that if we don't defend the rules-based order here, that we're the entire global economy will collapse. The truth is, most of the maritime trade going through the South China Sea is going or coming from Chinese ports. So China has an interest in keeping that commerce flowing, and it has not interfered with that commerce hardly at all. So really, again, let's not go to war over fish. Let's not go to war over some oil or gas prospects. This is really, the interests here are there, but they're not vital interests of the United States.
Do either of you guys, Shushan, do you want to respond?
Sure. Let me say that I agree with Lyle that the United States has a major stake in in South China Sea, in terms of what we want to make sure the United States continue to remain a credible ally, and carry out our alliance commitment with the Philippines. On the other hand, while on the other hand, make sure that we don't walk into a direct conflict with China. And I think I also agree with Lisa in terms of how we understand the goal of between peace and war, because that's not a binary situation, and there are a lot of other options, alternative and options that between purely a peace and war with China, right? So I think it's also in the U.S. interest to understand how to achieve this goal. In addition to military instruments we currently have, in addition to the military alliance partners that we currently have, can we achieve that with other instruments like diplomacy, economic statecraft, etc.? Like I said, what I observed is the U.S. approach, the U.S. ability of shaping China's behavior, other than using military tool, has been declining over the past decade. So how do we utilize what kind of tools other than military we still have vis-a-vis China to use as leverage to shape China's behavior, to shape its cost-benefit calculation when it comes to the South China Sea? It's one thing that I think we should have a better understanding and a better assessment of that. And also, I think I'm a little bit reluctant to envision or to call for a collective efforts by other U.S. major partners in the region, like India, Japan, South Korea, to come together to show our resistance to China's coercion in the South China Sea. Because I think I share Lyle's concern that China doesn't see South China Sea just as a separate theater from Taiwan or even East China Sea, because nowadays the Chinese analysts, Chinese strategists have been talking about Sanhai Liandong, meaning that the simultaneous flare-up of tensions in East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, and South China Sea. And what I'm concerned is, by showing our commitment, our determination in South China Sea, we might get the Chinese into a situation of have a situation of interdependence of commitment, meaning that the Chinese would feel they cannot be perceived as being weak in the South China Sea, so that they won't be taken advantage of in other theaters, such as Taiwan Strait, East China Sea, or even the border disputes with India. I think I'll stop here, and I'll look forward to further discussion.
Yeah, I just like to add in there. I agree that the military is a blunt tool, and the U.S. needs other tools. But I would argue that the Biden administration is doing exactly that. It's employing tools of bolstering partnerships and alliances, making this sort of networked architecture of relationships in the region, all at not containing China, but at least showing China that there will be pushback to it trying to dominate or push the region in the directions only it wants the region to go. So to me, the U.S. core interest is in protecting nation sovereignty, protecting their ability to have choices, and preventing China from being able to set the rules in the region, and preventing China from being able to thwart international norms like the 2016 arbitral ruling. It's not about fish, oil, or the economy. It's really about this stable balance in the Indo-Pacific region, and ensuring that these countries are able to preserve their sovereignty, so that we don't have one country calling all the shots and thwarting international norms when it feels like it. So I think this is what I would say is U.S. core interest in this idea of keeping a stable balance of power in the region that is not so that the region knows that the United States is there. It's not going to sort of leave the region and allow China to sort of dictate the terms of what's happening in the region.
Let me ask a follow-up to you, Lisa, which the others can weigh in on, but I'm just curious, given your experience in the government in particular, how should we think about this explicit declaratory policy that, as Shusen mentioned, we did, I think, under Obama with Japan with the Senkakus, where my understanding is previously the United States just didn't say how we would deal with the Senkakus. Here now we have a more official declaratory policy of kind of how far we would extend our alliance commitment to the Philippines. Why not just not say? Why not just leave? Okay, this is our ally. We'll defend them at some point. But do we have to say, what all the rocks and areas included in our alliance policy are?
Well, I think we did because the Philippines were demanding it. The Philippines were feeling like the Mutual Defense Treaty sort of needed updating. That's why we had the defense guidelines issued. And so there was a demand signal from the Philippines to sort of update U.S. commitments to this new kind of threat that they are facing. So I think it was necessary in the case of the Philippines to be more declaratory about what we considered activities that would invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty. And I think that is important to have in there. It's not like we're not dealing with the Taiwan issue, right? Where there is a reason for the ambiguous the ambiguous policy or the policy of ambiguity, however you want to call it. This is a different situation where the threat is changing, and China's probing and doing new things and using gray zone activity to try to achieve its maritime objectives. And so I think in this case it was necessary to be clear about what our alliance commitments were and are to the Philippines.
Lau, you wanted to respond? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just might disagree on a couple of points. To me, as to whether there is a kind of binary sort of war and peace, and whether we should play in the gray zone, I think there we have a fundamental disagreement. I'm very skeptical. I've heard people talk about the gray zone for a decade without coming up with any, wonderful solution to this problem. I think there are numerous problems, and the biggest one, of course, is risk. Where, how do we know when we've crossed the line? Putting aside the possibility of sort of accidental war coming about. But it seems to me when you play in this zone, you are inherently willing to risk war. And if most Americans would say, really, you're going to go to war over that reef, the American foreign policy establishment has to take that on board and act with all due caution. I don't see that at all. I think we're constantly leaning into these. If you watch Obama's behavior in the Scarborough Shoal crisis, that reflects exactly what Admiral Greenert advised, which was, we are not going to war. We should act accordingly. If you act like you might go to war, that ambiguity, if you will, which I think generally is a bad idea, not only do you take risks, but you set expectations all around, including in Manila, where they are willing to take risks and maybe don't have all U.S. interests in mind. And maybe Filipinos are willing to go to war over that, those rocks and reefs. But that's a fundamental divergence. And we should not consider that Philippine interests are identical to U.S. interests. There might be some serious divergence there. I would just add also that, look, I'm a realist. I don't think we should consider, war in far-flung locations just to prove kind of resolve or something like that, or credibility. I think we need to be honest with ourselves about our vital interests. And this is China's Caribbean, I think, as Kaplan said. Guess what, folks? We had Trumps in the Caribbean. We came up with a Monroe Doctrine. We told all other powers to get the hell out and stay out. And, our resolve and credibility is great there. Well, guess what? China has the opposite conditions here. And therefore, to play games, I think is just foolish. What we need is, Philippines to get real and to accept that it's going to have this relationship with China and try to get along with them. At various times they have. I'm convinced that the two, Manila and Beijing, could reach accommodation on a lot of these issues. I don't think China wants to go to war. And this issue is kind of self-equilibrating. That is, if China pushes and bullies and so forth, it just looks bad. And Indonesia gets mad and Vietnam gets mad. And Malaysia gets mad. So it faces a whole lot of bad publicity. Fine. Let's let that do the work. There's no need for the U.S. to play with a heavy hand here and play all these games. Moreover, by the way, we are broke. So, if we can't even agree on sending funds to Israel and Ukraine and all that, you're telling me we're now going to build the Philippines Coast Guard and decorate Philippines with all kinds of fancy missiles and surveillance gear and so forth. It's just, we need to have a more reasonable and feasible defense policy.
Yeah, I would clarify, Lau, you weren't arguing with Lisa there, right? I saw her raise her eyebrows. That wasn't Lisa's proposal to build up their Coast Guard, right?
Well, she said we should double down on the defense agreement there, and that does imply, some kind of upgrades, and indeed upgrades.
We already are, providing aid to the Philippines and helping with their Coast Guard, and I certainly do think that is the right approach. And it's already happening. I mean, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Yeah, we're arguing over aid to Ukraine and Israel right now, but that doesn't mean we have stopped all other assistance programs to all other countries. So I'm not quite sure, Lyle, what you're saying, because we're already providing military assistance to the Philippines, as well as Japan and other countries. I think India's providing the BrahMos to the Philippines. So there's all kinds of programs that are continuing and will continue.
Well, just, if you don't mind, I would say that, yes, we are, but it's peanuts. And the Chinese know it, and that's why, they're winning this gray zone game, and it's not even close. Show me what Philippines Coast Guard there is. The Chinese are basically laughing. So to get serious in this game, we would have to spend billions and billions. I don't think we're willing to do that, and we shouldn't. And by the way, Philippines, again, I shouldn't tell them what kind of risks to take and how they should spend their money, but they have some huge threats looming over them. Those are typhoons, super typhoons. Thousands of Filipinos die, on a regular basis because of those. That's a first order threat. They should spend a lot of money hardening their infrastructure, not buying any ship cruise missiles. Number two, they have a major terrorism problem, right? We know the story of Marawi and what happened there in 2017. So these are first order, almost existential threats to the Philippines. So I think they may want to reprioritize. I'm not from the Philippines, but that's
right. But I think the Filipinos probably would also argue that threats to their sovereignty and territory, that they consider theirs, is also somewhat of an existential threat. So I think that you can't really rank order what is of importance there. And then I would just note that the Philippines is, it's not employing its big guns, it's big ships. It's taking when it's trying to confront the Chinese gray zone activities, it's using creative means. It's deliberately using smaller fishing vessels, etc., because it doesn't want to be provocative. It's trying to make a point, but at the same time, not be overly provocative. So I think there are ways to push back, and it's right to push back. And I think the way the Philippines is going about it is laudable.
Shushan, you've been neglected here for a minute. Go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to just quickly add, since we were talking about the Filipinos, because from my interviews and discussions with former U.S. government officials, there's a common theme that keeps resurfacing, is that the United States doesn't trust the Philippines to the same level as we do with the Japanese. That's a factor, a major reason that has kept the United States from providing as unequivocal alliance affirmation as we gave to the Japanese regarding the Senkakus. I think, well, as we look back on what the Philippines Coast Guards or armed force have been doing in South China Sea, I think on the part of the Philippines, they do need to to boost the U.S. confidence in their capacity or capabilities, in terms that if we look at Philippines confrontation at sea clashes not only with Chinese but also with other claimants, they fatally shot. I think they have constantly have the problem of having fatal accidents with other claimants, like with a Vietnamese fisherman, right? Like in 2017, and also even a few years ago with Taiwan, with fishermen from Taiwan, they also killed several Taiwan fishermen. I think this sort of performance and apparent lack of discipline is not helpful in boosting U.S. confidence in further step up our commitment to the Philippines, because that really get us in trouble.
Okay. No, I don't. Why don't you bake your added remarks into the next question if you could? I think you could manage. I wanted to pick up on a point that Shushan made about this. I'm going to characterize it differently than you did, but almost excessive U.S. credibility. You argued essentially that, if I take your point, that it's possible to over reassure allies, which I think is kind of an alien concept in Washington, but that you could reassure allies so much that they avoid settlements that they might otherwise make. And so in some ways we're incentivizing a degree of instability that otherwise wouldn't exist. So I wondered if you could just elaborate on that point, and then if the other panelists want to respond, that would be great. Do you want to just make that point again or elaborate on it, Shushan? Or can you say what you mean about over assuring the Philippines and potentially blocking accommodation?
Right, I think it's based on the political science literature on alliance politics, because the fear on the part of the Philippines is being abandoned by its bigger ally, the United States. But on the part of the United States, our major concern is being dragged unnecessarily, unwantedly dragged into a conflict that started initially between the Chinese and the Philippines. So, in other words, we want to avoid a situation where, simply because now we're so into this strategic competition with China, and we're so into this consolidation of our alliances in the Indo-Pacific, to the extent that we are risking writing a blank check to our allies that basically telling them you can go around, you get our support, we have your back, that kind of situation. So I think that's what basically I mean by entrapment. I'm not saying that it's exactly what the Philippines have been doing. Yes, China has been coerced in the Philippines in recent incidents, but I think that's also inherent risk that a potential risk that the United States need to guard against, while we reassure our allies in South China Sea.
Yeah, and I take your point on entrapment, but I think there's a separate matter, which I thought you brought up, which I would refer to as moral hazard, which is basically that you give your allies assurances so they feel more willing or able to run risks with you standing behind them and supporting them than they otherwise would. And one consequence of that moral hazard, arguably, is to prevent settlements of territorial disputes and things of that nature, or at least accommodations that would otherwise occur.
Right,
So,
that's kind of emboldening your ally, right? It's also a consequence from the entrapment or overcommitment. It's like you have a car insurance, and you might tend to drive more recklessly than otherwise.
yeah. So I just wondered if Lisa, you wanted to argue with that at all, or Lyle, you wanted to put in your 2 cents, maybe in that order.
Yeah, I guess I would go back to the Duterte times. I was at the National Security Council during those years, and those were difficult times. And we almost saw the visiting forces agreement go out the door. And so I think the issues are real. It's not as if there's not a need to show commitment to our alliances. And I think that's what, when the Biden administration came in, that's what they were faced with the Philippines, was trying to rebuild a relationship with an ally that was slipping away to some degree. And so it was necessary to rebuild that trust. I'm not disagreeing. I think that, that's definitely, the entrapment issue is real, and one has to guard against that. But you have to look at the context of what you're dealing with. And with the Philippines, the alliance was not in great shape when the Biden administration came to power. And it's obviously doing a lot better now. There's a lot more trust, a lot more confidence, and that trust and confidence has to go both ways. And I think that the U.S. government officials, military officials that I've spoken to, are very aware of the idea of not, I don't know if it's over assuring, but making sure that the Philippines is not being provocative, or they need to be coordinating very closely with the U.S. Behind the scenes, so that there is communication. There never can be too much communication between allies about what's happening. So I think all of that's very important. But I would just say, in the case with the Philippines, I think we're in the right place when it comes to the level of reassurance that the Biden administration is giving to the Philippines right now. I think it's the right amount.
Yeah, I would definitely have a few disagreements there. I mean, to me, there is such a thing as too much communication between allies and too many issues on the plate. I mean, the United States has a full plate of issues when it comes to national security. And, if you think that serious people in DC have time to figure out, what this next iteration of the resupply to Second Thomas Shoal is, I just don't think we have the bandwidth, and we do it poorly, and we shouldn't pretend like we can govern every part of the world. That's, honestly, I think it's leaning toward the ridiculous or even the insane, because the risks are there. So, with our hands full in other parts of the world, I think we're literally playing with fire. We should make one communication very clear to Manila. That is, we're not going to go to war over these rocks and reefs. That would immediately clarify a lot of things, and actually think the Philippines would act.
Do you think we should just say that in private or as public?
I think public too, because, Americans, we all know that. I mean, of course, nobody will do that. No president will do that because it's, then they would be criticized for being soft or whatever. But to me, this reflects our real interests, and Americans are really bad at being honest with ourselves. We're great at bluffing, but speaking of bluffing, I must say I disagree with Lisa's point. She says the Philippines are holding back the big guns. They're playing in the gray zone with little fishing boats, but they're holding back that there are no big guns, in my view. I've looked at the Philippines armed forces for a long time. We gave them some Hamilton cutters, which I think they try to stand up as destroyers. They can't even go to sea. They're more than 30 years old. They're not seaworthy. I mean, again, the Chinese are having a good laugh about this. Let's not kid ourselves. They are not, Philippines armed forces would last for less than a day in a contest. And of course, we would have to be there. We'd be left holding the bag and fighting a war. And this gets to your larger point, Ben. I call it bad friend syndrome. That is, we act like we're reassuring across the board. We're giving all these aid. We've got a million programs, from soup to nuts, from pandemic to reforestation to everything, sea turtles, and you got it. And it sounds great, but like it gives this third party country the idea that we can solve all their problems. And actually, we can't solve many of them at all. And finally, let's face it, there are Ukraine shadows all over this situation. And I think Manila has been trying to read them and has been leaning hard into this Taiwan issue, probably because they rightly believe they can get a lot more goodies from Washington if they do so. I think this is a very dangerous move for Philippines. And, indeed, I expect as I said, I think that's the major driver behind what's going on right now, driving the tension. And I think that if it does come to war over Taiwan, that Philippines, unfortunately, will be on the target list and relatively high up on the target list. Because if it does allow extensive U.S. basing in a Taiwan scenario, it will be hit hard. And that, Philippines should not become another battlefield for the major powers. Over.
Lisa, you can respond if you want, or we'll press on. Up to you. But go ahead.
Let's just press on. Yeah, I think I've stated my case clearly at this point. So let's just move.
Sure. I guess the next question is, to what extent is this a local issue? So should we view, Lyle said the South China Sea is what's happening there is very linked to Taiwan, but what do people think about the extent to which events in the South China Sea are part of a broader pattern of expanding Chinese aggression, where they, the more they eat, the hungrier they get? Or should we just view this as a discrete problem between China and the Philippines? Like, let's say the Philippines more or less settled on Chinese terms, gave up the ghost. Would that lead to greater Chinese aggression elsewhere? Lisa, you already said essentially you think it would, but maybe we can just go through and people can talk about to what extent this is a local problem, or what extent this is indicative of broader Chinese behavior around at least other areas of Asia. Maybe we'll go back to the original ordering, Lyle, Shushen, Lisa.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hawks here are arguing, of course, that this is, the canary in the coal mine. This is maritime aggression. It's just the first move in a long series of moves that would, I guess, at some point include Hawaii and then California and who knows what else, Texas or something. But, I just don't see that. I think these are very localized issues. Again, if you look around the world, you'll see maritime disputes and fishing disputes everywhere we look, including, as Shushen was pointing out, there are serious disputes between ASEAN countries as well. I do think that China has been pretty restrained here. Like I said, they've led with their Coast Guard, and we may not like it, but, the good news is we haven't seen a lot of fatalities here. I think China knows that it will suffer in the minds of, world public opinion and so forth. They know that their relationship with, say, Malaysia and other countries will be impacted. Now, look, is China expanding its presence, on the world's oceans? Absolutely. The Chinese Navy is growing. I think they may, I can't rule it out that they will seek to be a kind of peer of the U.S. Navy that is equal. And even, I could say, even 20 years down the line, who knows? It could even be superior. I don't think that necessarily constitutes a threat, but as often is said, if you treat China like an enemy, it will behave like one. I think that is a major concern. And, Chinese influence and the Chinese military sort of cropping up here and there. For example, there's a lot of talk of this new base could be a new base in Cambodia. I don't rule it out. It's possible, though, again, China has played very cautiously. I think the U.S. has something like 800 foreign bases or foreign facilities of various types. China has, I think, one. So, I think we have to not be too paranoid, have to realize that China is going to be a global power. And by the way, also realize that China may push around its neighbors occasionally. I believe the U.S. has been known to do that too. I think we get 7 states out of the war with Mexico. That was a pretty good deal for us. I think we'll be very happy if China is more restrained, and indeed it will be more restrained. That's just not done in the modern era, and moreover, China last used force on a major, on a large scale in 1979. That's a long time ago. So, I think there's reason to be cautiously optimistic here. I don't think this is the canary in the coal mine. I think we just have to knock heads together and hope Manila and Beijing can find their way to a better place. And, occasionally they do agree on a lot of things. So we should encourage that. Over.
Go ahead.
Okay, I think South China Sea could have been, to some extent, compartmentalized from other issues like Taiwan and East China Sea, but unfortunately, over the past decade, because of the action-reaction dynamics in South China Sea, East China Sea, and increasingly we're seeing a confluence of the 2 seas, East China Sea and South China Sea, and eventually, the Taiwan, as well as the confluence of 3 seas. Because we brought in, not only our allies and partners in Southeast Asia, but also, over the past decade under the Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo's second term, we encouraged the Japanese to revise their use of their ODA charter to allow the use of ODA, the Japanese ODA, to finance, the donation of patrol ships to Vietnam and to the Philippines, and also to encourage, the Japanese to relax their defense equipment export principles so that they can, start exporting, transferring, defense equipment to the Southeastern countries as part of the U.S.-Japanese alliance efforts to build capacity for Southeastern countries. And also at the same time, India was also brought into this picture under Modi's Act East strategy. So now we are seeing, a confluence of not just the 3 seas, but also to potentially, a land sea confluence, meaning that China also sees somehow a link between its land border disputes with India and also the South China Sea as well, and eventually also brought in Australia as well. So I think as a result of the whole series of events that we are eventually seeing something that could be compartmentalized, contained and compartmentalized at local issue, eventually get to some a structural level issue. But let me reemphasize that over a decade ago, more than a decade ago, Michael Swain wrote an article arguing that South China Sea is not China's core interest, and I still agree. And recently, I'm looking at how willing that Beijing has been, how Beijing has been willing to share profits that it harvested from Xinjiang and Hainan. Beijing has been more generous in giving, in sharing more profits from Xinjiang to help, achieve socio-political goals in that region, which is obviously a core interest to Beijing. But Beijing has, for over a decade or so, been very reluctant to give Hainan more money, to share more profits and tax revenue with Hainan. Although Hainan has been crying for more resources to be put into its maritime administration system. So let me stop there. I think, as a result of, the interactions over the past decades, we have failed to compartmentalize an issue that could have been contained at local level.
So, yeah, let me say, I think that the China's behavior vis-a-vis the Philippines and the South China Sea is part of a larger problem. It's part of a larger problem of destabilizing behavior that risks causing wider stability in the region, and it's part of a pattern of aggressive activity that we have seen from China, not only in the Taiwan Strait with regard to some of its military activities there, but also on the border with India, the China-India border, where we saw very provocative activities by the Chinese in 2020, and leading to a crisis between those two states. So I think that we can look at other things that are happening. We can look at the fact that the Chinese were probably unhappy that the Australians agreed to the trilateral joint patrol exercise, and then we saw the sonar incident by the Chinese warship, which actually caused injury to some Australian sailors, shortly after this visit by Prime Minister Albanese to Beijing. So there is a pattern here, and hope is not a policy. We can hope all we want, but it's not going to impact events. And I think it's the responsibility of the U.S. to use its policy tools, not just military, but diplomatic, economic. It's leverage its alliance relationships to maintain stability in this region. And if the U.S. were to completely ignore China's destabilizing activity, I think that would be irresponsible. And I think that it's incumbent on the U.S. that U.S. power does still matter. The U.S. does still have policy tools that can help maintain stability and help nations maintain their own sovereignty. And it would be irresponsible if the U.S. does not apply those tools to this particular situation in the South China Sea.
We have 3 minutes exactly left. If each of you, maybe Lisa, Shushan, and then Lyle, can just give, if you had a bullet point recommendation that you wanted the president or whomever to take away here for what U.S. policy should be in the South China Sea, what would it be? And so we have to keep it brief. Go ahead, Lisa, please.
Well, I think transparency is a great tool. You can't underestimate the power of naming and shaming. So continuing to focus on what it is China's doing and what its goals are with its tactics is really important. So I would argue for keeping up the filming of the incidents and keep showing what China is doing. I think that's a really important tool that the U.S. has.
I think for the United States, on one thing, first stand firm with respect to our alliance commitment to the Philippines, but at the same time give some kind of qualification to it, as we did to the Japanese. And second, I think the United States should behind ASEAN to truly support ASEAN to function as a central platform to manage tensions in the region. And thirdly, I think the United States should understand that its ability to shape Chinese behavior is when China has overall positive relations with all the actors, with the Philippines, the United States, and ASEAN as well, because at that point it'd be much more costly for the Chinese to behave badly.
Good, impressive speed talking. Lyle, you have 70 seconds. Go ahead.
All right.
Wrap it up.
I would advise the U.S. leadership to avoid PR games. I think that's what a lot of this is. We're at a very dangerous point in our relationship with China, and it's having bad reverberations across all kinds of other issue areas, the global economy, the fight against global warming and so forth. So what we need is quiet diplomacy. I think with Philippines, we want to focus on preparing for typhoons and acting against terrorism. And we should just keep in mind that the Philippines is rather easily defended. If we want to pour a lot of concrete and build pillboxes and things like that on the main island, sure, and we will defend Philippines if it's invaded. But we should not play games with rocks and reefs. We're literally just pouring gasoline on U.S.-China relations, and that's exceedingly dangerous in this world of where China is a superpower and a nuclear superpower. So we really should be much more cautious. Thank you.
Perfect. With that, thank you, all three of you, very much for speaking to us, and for those out there watching, thanks for listening. I hope it was informative, and we'll be back with more events and defense priorities in the future. Thank you very much.